Did I bring in Marianne?
I see everyone here, yes. More people are coming in.
Yep.
Can we see the participants list or not?
If you click participants.
Okay.
There's options.
Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Shane Mark. I'm the Assistant Director for Public Works for the town of Needham. Welcome to our third public meeting on the Needham Newton Community Way Feasibility Study. We're so happy that you took time out of your evening tonight to spend the next hour, hour and a half to 2 hours with us to learn about the study, where we are with the study. And GPI will do a great job with presenting that tonight. So welcome. We appreciate you being here. A few housekeeping items before we get started tonight. Tonight's presentation will be posted on both Newton's website as well as Needham's website under the project. So if you have to leave early, or if you know of anyone that missed tonight, was unable to attend, just point them to Newton's webpage and Needham's webpage, and a recorded version will be on those websites. Also, we're in the process of reviewing the draft report and providing comments. The final report for the feasibility study will be released on Friday, September 22nd for public release, and that'll also be posted on both websites. And thirdly, if you're interested, this upcoming Tuesday, September 12th at 6 p.m., there is a Needham Select Board meeting. And as part of that agenda on the Select Board, GPI and the folks from Needham will be there presenting where we stand with the study to the Needham Select Board. Folks from the working group and folks from the public from both Newton and Needham are welcome to attend that if you'd like. That is 6 p.m. on the 12th of September, which is this upcoming Tuesday at Needham Town Hall in the Select Board chambers. With that said, I want to recognize any of the elected officials from Needham. I'm looking through our list here, and I see that the chair of our Select Board, Marianne Cooley, is here. So I'd like to recognize her tonight. And Marianne, is there anything you'd like to say before we get started?
I gave her, she can talk, but she's unmuted. She's muted.
I don't see that she's unmuting, so welcome. We appreciate having our Select Board chair here this evening. I don't see any other elected officials from Needham. If I've missed anyone, I do apologize. Josh, I'll turn it over to you to recognize any of the elected officials from Newton.
Thank you, Shane. Hello, Josh Ostroff, Director of Transportation Planning in the Planning and Development Office, working in Newton City Hall. Thanks for being here, folks from Newton. I don't see any electeds. I know that there's many other meetings that are happening, but I do see at least one member of the Upper Falls Area Council. So I'd like to welcome those representatives, and we look forward to engaging with you this evening and in the weeks to come as we process the results of the study and consider next steps. Back to you, Shane.
Thank you, Josh. Appreciate it. Once again, welcome all. Just to outline the format of tonight, we're going to turn it over to Carolyn Radish with GPI. She's going to recognize the team and she'll do the presentation for us tonight. While the presentation is going on, we are not going to take any live questions. However, we don't want to discourage you from asking questions. So if you look at the bottom of your screens on your Zoom, if you hover your mouse at the bottom, you should see a bar that pops up, which allows you access to your microphone, video, etc. And there are two speech bubbles there that says Q&A, that stands for question and answers. So if you have any questions tonight, if you have any questions in relation to the study or need some clarification, please type your question in there. All you have to do is click on it. You can ask your question, and then the team that is on the presentation from both Newton, Needham, and GPI will be looking and reviewing those questions. And at the end of the presentation, we'll go through those questions and get through as many of those questions as we possibly can. So we want to encourage everyone to ask questions. That's why we're here tonight. Please do it in that question and answer speech bubbles at the bottom of the screen. With that said, I'm going to turn it over to Carolyn Radish with GPI.
Thank you, Shane. Good evening and welcome, everybody. We're very excited to meet with the Newton and Needham community to talk about the findings of our feasibility study for the Community Way. I want to introduce my team here. My name is Carolyn Radish. I am with Greenman Peterson, Inc. I'm the project manager for this. John Diaz is the project director for this project, and he is an engineer. We also have our structural team with us, Mike Shoestack and Nicole O'Connor, who know everything about the bridge aspects of the project. We also have Matt Kearney, who is a civil engineer at GPI, and he has extensive experience with rail trails, as does Mike, in terms of figuring out how to improve the corridors. Matt worked on the Bruce Freeman Rail Trail nearby in Acton, Maynard, and Concord, and also the Assabet River Rail Trail most recently, as well as some others. Our GPI team has been assisted by a working group, including staff from Needham and Newton, and also some community members that have particular expertise that have been of great assistance to us. So I just wanted to recognize everybody here, Kate Fitzpatrick, the town manager in Needham, Cecilia Simchak, who is the director of finance and administration for Needham, Stacy Mulroy, director of parks and recreation, Lieutenant McGrath from the Needham Police Department, Tyler Gabrielski from DPW, who is running the show tonight and has been a huge assist to our group as well. And then Josh has also been working closely with Jennifer Steele, who is the chief environmental planner in Newton. And then we have with us also George Kirby, who is a Newton resident and is the Newton Upper Falls Greenway co-founder, and he is a panelist here tonight. George, you can wave. We have, I'm very sorry. I neglected to mention Deborah Crossley, City Councilor of Newton, who is also on our working group. And we have Duncan Allen, who's a Needham resident and is also an MBTA advisory board member, who is on our panel tonight, and also James Goldstein, who is a Needham resident, a Rail Trail Advisory Committee member, and president of the Bay Colony Rail Trail Association. So that is our panel for tonight. And with that, I'm going to share my screen here and go through the slides that we have prepared. So does everyone see? Is that sharing okay? Yes, okay. All right, very good. So the meeting's being recorded. These are the links to the Town of Needham webpage for this project, and also the Town of Newton webpage for this project. And you can find all the information regarding this this feasibility study, including the feasibility study that will be posted on the 22nd, as Shane mentioned, as well as the slides for this meeting. In terms of our working organization here, this is a joint effort between the Town of Needham and the City of Newton. Shane is the project manager working closely with Josh from Newton, and then we are working for the communities. Our agenda tonight, we just did the welcome introductions. I'm going to go over just an overview of the study scope and just a review of the project area. We're going to talk a little bit about the main takeaways about what we heard from the community in April when we had the first public meetings on the project as we were just getting started on the feasibility study. Then we're going to go through the Community Way design alternatives and costs. We're going to talk a little bit about next steps and the takeaways in terms of the feasibility study, and then also take questions and comments. So the purpose of the meeting is to inform the public about the findings of the feasibility and to collect public input, which will help the communities make decisions about the community way in the future. So the study scope and overview of the area. So the initial study was defined as going from Needham Heights to the Upper Falls Greenway, which is here at the Charles River in Newton. Through the course of this project, the study boundaries were refined based on our outreach with the MBTA and also with Mass DOT. So the MBTA is using the right-of-way beyond the Needham Heights station. And so they would not entertain a lease for using the right-of-way for a bike ped path or a bike ped and shuttle path beyond Webster Street. So the western terminus of the project is Webster Street in Newton. And similarly, beyond the Charles River, the path would need to have accessible entrances at both ends. So being able to get to a public sidewalk for ADA purposes. So for that reason, the easterly terminus of the project was extended beyond the beginning of the Upper Falls Greenway to Oak Street. So the project study area that we looked at for this feasibility study goes from Webster Street in Needham to Oak Street in Newton. That corridor is just shy of a mile, 5,000 linear feet, and the right-of-way is typically 82.5 feet wide along this corridor. So the scope of the study was defined in the federal grant that funded the feasibility study. And that is to provide a community way between Needham Heights and the Upper Falls Greenway in Newton, as I just mentioned, and how that has been refined through the study. And to consider a shared use path, and two options for that were specifically called out: a path that accommodates only bicycles and pedestrians, and also look at an alternative that is a way that accommodates bicycles, pedestrians, and electric shuttle buses. So the recommendations for design and construction are based on standards and the feasibility of the different elements of the project, the bridges, the corridor. Further planning and selection of a preferred alternative will be undertaken by the communities of Needham and Newton. So just corridor conditions. This is the corridor in Needham. This is a little bit easterly of Gould Street. And, you know, the rails are still in place as well as some of the ties that you're starting to see overgrowth where there is, over the years, it's been almost 90 years since a train has run down this particular section of the corridor. The grade changes in this case as much of the corridor is elevated above ground level. So this is higher than the adjoining parking areas. This is a photo here at Webster Street where it's closer to actual grade. The rails are in place here. This is a grade crossing of Webster Street. There's also a grade crossing of Gould Street and Oak Street of the railroad corridor. This is the right-of-way at Route 128 I-95. So as probably most people know, there was a rail bridge here until 8 years ago. And that it was removed to add additional lanes to Route 128 for the MassDOT's Add a Lane project. So now we have basically 3 lanes in either direction on Route 128 I-95, as well as 2 exit lanes and 2 on-ramp lanes at this location. So altogether, we have 6 + 4, 10 lanes. And it's about 225 feet to span this distance across I-95. There's still, you can see an earthen fill area, which, you know, the path of the tracks, as well as concrete retaining walls. This is the bridge over the Charles River, and this bridge is a steel beam structure on concrete and masonry abutments and wing walls. On the Newton side, there was a new deck that was placed in there. However, it is currently fenced off to pedestrian use. On the Needham side, it has not been improved, and you can see that there are still ties from the railroad that is in place on the bridge. And the final segment that goes between the Charles River and Oak Street is the Upper Falls Greenway in Newton. This has been improved as a stone dust surface bike ped path. So that is an overview of the project area. I'm just going to go with main takeaways of what we heard through the April 2023 online community survey and through the questions that we got from the public. So 445 people responded to the online survey. So there's high interest in this project. You know, about half were Needham residents, about half were Newton residents, about half were residents that reside near the Community Way or the Upper Falls Greenway. And most of the respondents that responded to the online survey did not attend the public informational meeting. So only about 14% of the people that responded to the survey went to the public presentation. Just in terms of the questions we asked, the main takeaway in terms of how people would use the Community Way if it were improved, most people felt they would use it for recreation, with 71% of the online survey respondents saying that they would be very likely to use the Community Way for recreation. And 68% of the residents or the respondents said it was very unlikely that they would use it for commuting to work or to school. Other trip purposes, you know, got a range of whether they would use it for shopping. 29% of respondents thought that they would use it for shopping, very likely. Travel for social activities, 27% thought they would use it for that purpose, very likely. And then travel for appointments is, you know, 38% thought it would be very unlikely that they would use the Community Way for that purpose. In terms of preferences for a bicycle and pedestrian only path versus a bicycle, pedestrian, and shuttle path, you know, over 2/3 of the respondents supported bicycle and pedestrian path only. A little bit under 1/3 would like to see it used for pedestrian, bicycles, and shuttles. So with that background, we developed two alternatives, and we did very high level engineering and calculations to determine, you know, how feasible the two options would be, as well as what they would cost. So two broad alternatives that we have already sort of touched on would be the bicycle and pedestrian shared use path. So this is overall 18 feet altogether, which is a 12-foot path with 3-foot shoulders. This is a paved path that would be, these are the design standards that would be applied and used for developing the shared use path in this location. We did assume that public funding would be used for this project to improve the corridor as well as the bridges. So money through FHWA, MassDOT, federal and state sources. That means that we need to meet design criteria established by both the state and the federal agencies that oversee these projects. So that is driving a lot of the design decisions that we have made in this feasibility study. The shuttle inclusive path would be 34 feet in width. So that would include the 18-foot bicycle and ped component here, 12-foot path, 3-foot shoulders, and then a separate shuttle path, which is basically an 11-foot lane with 2-foot shoulders. All of this separated by a fence for a total width of 34 feet. So this is then what we assumed would be the shuttle inclusive path that we used for looking at alternatives. Looking at improvements to the right-of-way corridor and the bridge over Route 128 I-95, which is a blank slate at this point. However, the Charles River Bridge has structural elements in place. And so to fit the limitations and opportunities with those structural elements, there were 3 variations on alternative 2 to cross at the Charles River Bridge, which we'll discuss in a few minutes. So in terms of the bridge over I-95 Route 128, the large takeaway is that the easterly approach here on this side would need to be raised to meet the vertical clearance standards for the highway. And that, the structural team looked at the option for both a single span bridge and a double span bridge. So this is a double span bridge. It has a center pier. So there's two spans of bridges here. And determined that the single span is likely infeasible and that a double span would be required, which would include a central pier in the median of Route 128 I-95. That everything about this bridge would require MassDOT and FHWA approval in order to be built in this location. The Charles River Bridge, as we mentioned before, includes some existing abutments and the steel beam that is crossing this rail bridge. This has some limitations in terms of what we can use it for. So the existing beam, the existing structure is in satisfactory conditions. The beams, the abutments, there would be some repairs to the masonry, the concrete to correct spalling and some missing mortar in the masonry wall, and to also fix bolts on the beam itself. But basically, the structures are in satisfactory condition. The existing structures can accommodate a bike ped path, the 18-foot bike ped path with no problem. The existing deck would need to be replaced, and it would be concrete for a shared use path. However, for the wider alternative 2, that cannot be accommodated on the existing beam and the wing walls on the abutment. So because of that, we had to come up with some alternatives of how we might widen and add structural abutments in order to accommodate the wider path. The first alternative was to have a narrower path, which would be 26 feet, which is the maximum that we could have using this beam and a new abutment here on the existing masonry wall. So we cannot have anything wider than 26 feet there. Whoops, sorry. And so that would mean that we would have a bridge crossing that's narrower than the 34-foot path that is going elsewhere along the corridor. That would require design exception from MassDOT to have a narrower bridge than the path. And to accommodate this whole alternative to the shuttle, the bikes, and the pedestrians, we would have a narrower overall section in terms of, a 9-foot shared use path for the bicycles and pedestrians, 2-foot shoulders instead of 3-foot shoulders, 9 feet instead of 12 feet. So that's, then a constrained width. And then on the shuttle side, we would narrow the travel lane from 11 feet to 10 feet and have 1-foot shoulders instead of 2-foot shoulders and then 1 foot for the fencing. So that is how, we would narrow down the bike ped shuttle option to 26 feet in one of the bridge crossing alternatives. We would need to have exceptions, as I mentioned, for a narrow bridge as well as for a narrower shared use path and shoulders. The second alternative is to do a full width, 34 foot across the Charles River, as well as, matching the connecting parts of the corridor itself. This would require new abutments for the bridge over the Charles River. And so this is showing simply what is wider. So the shoulders are both 1 foot wider than alternative 2A. The path is 3 feet wider than alternative 2A. And the travel lane for the shuttle is another foot and the shoulders are wider. So that's the difference between the 26 foot and the 34 foot. What you don't see at the section level is that the substructure is much greater in terms of accommodating the wider bridge. Then the final option that we looked at for crossing the Charles River is to accommodate 2 bridges. So we would use the existing beam and abutment wing walls for a bicycle pedestrian bridge, like alternative 1, and then have a separate shuttle bridge that would require new abutments in order to accommodate this second bridge. So going across the bridge, it would be completely separate bridge structures. Because of the way that the existing beams are accommodated within the 82-foot right-of-way, the second bridge would have to be on the north side of the right-of-way for the shuttle. So the shuttle would go along the north side of the right-of-way if this alternative were used for crossing the Charles River. There were also questions at the meeting that we had in April, the public meetings about how do you widen the path along the corridor. And so that, how you widen the path, it determines how much retaining walls you have, how much earthwork you have, which in turn affects the cost. So these are a couple of graphics that we did for illustrative purposes. This is not an actual section. But this shows, typically this is the situation that we have along the corridor where we have this sort of trapezoidal fill section that is in place. And so, how we get that section wider from, its current, 15 feet to accommodate the 18-foot, 12-foot path, 3-foot shoulders is, we can grade it down. Here, this is showing where the existing grade is. You shave it down a little bit and then you're further down the trapezoid. So you're in a wider part of the path. So that's, that's one way to do it. Other areas we would need to have retaining walls. So we did calculate that as part of our feasibility study and cost analysis. For alternative 1, we're looking at about 2,000 linear feet of retaining walls along the corridor. And then to look at how you get the wider path in here. So we're going from an 18-foot path now to a 34-foot path. And so again, accommodating that within the existing grade. A couple things that are done is, grading it down as well as putting in retaining walls on either side with fill that helps to have the larger flat area. So when you do that, this is the 34-foot shuttle inclusive alternative. We also, where there are steep drop-offs like this, like the retaining walls, we have to have railings on the pedestrian side, and we need to have a guardrail crash barrier for the vehicle side. And for the vehicles, we need to have a 4-foot offset between the guardrail and the retaining wall. On the pedestrian side, we need 1 foot between the pedestrian railing and the retaining wall. So you can see how when we're looking at a section like this, where we're elevated, that, to get the 34-foot wider path, it involves more grading as well as potentially retaining walls, and the retaining walls themselves, have to be out further in order to accommodate, a crash barrier for the vehicle side and railings for the pedestrian side. Again, this is an illustrative section to kind of give a sense for, what we're looking at when we are looking at the improvements along the corridor itself. So alternative 2 had about almost 3,700 linear feet of retaining walls in order to accommodate the 34-foot path that includes the shuttle. We also looked into right-of-way licenses and encroachments along the path. So, over time, it's not unusual on abandoned railroad corridors that are not fenced, that there's, the adjoining properties start to kind of not quite know exactly where their property line is and kind of use some of the area along the right of way. The MBTA also issues licenses for citizens or municipalities or companies that wish to use the right of way. And so these are all things that would need to be accommodated in the design as well. Within the project area, the licensees that the MBTA has for the corridor are primary utility companies, which again is not unusual, as well as WC VBTV on TV Way in Needham has a license, I believe, for parking. So we would need to work within those licensed users. Utility, companies need to have access to their utilities. Generally that can be worked out with a shared use path. In looking at the aerial mapping that was just collected for the corridor, there are some additional encroachments that we observed that would need to be followed up on in project design. Just material and equipment storage from businesses that abut the corridor at Arbor Road and Fremont Street, and also landscaping from the Wingate residences at Gould Road goes pretty far into the corridor. So these are the encroachments that we noticed. None of these seems to be anything that would make this project infeasible. The corridor would likely conflict with the landscaping at Wingate residences. Thinking about the corridor and the grade crossings. So we have grade crossings at Webster Street, Gould Street, Oak Street. This is an example of a crossing for a bike ped path. This is a photo from Bruce Freeman in Acton. So, this is what the crossing looks like. It has these median islands in the path that direct traffic away from the corridor so people don't drive onto the bike ped path. There's high visibility crosswalks. It would need to be ADA accessible with detectable warning panels. We would likely have, these are called rectangular rapid flashing beacons that warn cars that people are crossing at the path. And so this is what a typical path would look like. We have pavement markings so that the bike and ped traffic know that they're coming up to a crossing. We don't have a picture of a shuttle bike ped combination, but you can visualize that you would then have, in addition to the bike ped crossing, you would also have another travel lane with the shuttle that would be crossing here as well, with probably a stop sign or some kind of traffic control. There were several questions about vegetation removal. So that is also, there would be vegetation removed as part of the project. This is a typical condition along the community way. And this is, again, something that we see a lot with rail trails. Basically, where there was fill, you see less larger trees, more brush. And then you have the larger trees. Even this, you can see that these are smaller trees. The larger ones may be out towards the edge of the right of way, where the ground is better. So this is sort of an existing condition just easterly of Webster Street. And then again, another photograph of, a 12-foot path with 2-foot shoulders, so how that looks. So you still have within the 82-foot right-of-way for alternative 1, you still have 64.5 feet of that right-of-way. So, roughly 32-foot buffers on either side of the path, which is a lot of space for the trees and for the existing trees to remain. With alternative 2, again, a 34-foot way within the 82-foot right-of-way, there's still 48.5 feet that would remain open space. Sometimes that's in slope banks, but it is vegetated. And so that again, 24 feet on either side of the path is typical. Just looking at natural and cultural resources in the area, as well as, hazardous materials. So, we did a desktop review of the resources that are out there. Obviously, the major natural resources is the Charles River, which is open water. There were not other wetland areas along this particular rail corridor. This would require some permits, local, federal, state permits, depending on which alternative the permitting would have slightly different requirements. There were no hazardous material site, although all rail corridors had trains running over them. So there are, further studies that would be done at the project engineering level and approaches that are taken to manage the earth along the corridor in terms of the cut and fill. And then in terms of historic resources, this is a National Register district here in the Upper Falls area. This is adjacent to the Upper Falls Greenway. This is not adjacent to our particular study area. It starts right at Oak Street where ours ends. And this is a local historic district in green here, also in the Upper Falls area. So there's nothing really abutting in terms of historic resources. The Charles River Bridge is an inventoried property in terms of the historic district. And there are a couple structures on Chestnut Street, but those are, the properties abut, but the buildings are oriented towards Charles Street. So all of those are considerations with respect to the permitting. We don't see anything that would cause the projects to be infeasible. This is just a quick environmental permitting survey summary, not to get into it in too much detail. It is in detail in the feasibility study, but basically for alternative 2, there's some more permitting that would be involved because of the work within the Charles River corridor to have to expand the abutments. So, there'd be local notice of intent to the Needham and Newton CONSCOM, some, MEPA filing. Alternative 1, again, is more straightforward. It could even possibly be seen as maintenance of that existing bridge, but alternative 2 has more steps to go through in terms of permitting at the state and even federal level. So in terms of costs, so we ran costs for all of the alternatives and the variations for crossing the Charles River. And the costs include construction costs. They're based on Mass DOT's costs that are available, as well as our project experience for bridge and rail trail development. And we came up with construction costs. And all of these costs include contingencies for the estimate. So 25% of the construction cost is an estimate contingency, which reflects how early we are in the design process. It's very high level. We're working off of aerial photos and a LiDAR survey. We don't have detailed survey information. So we are, so we have a large contingency for things that were unforeseen at this high level. We have a construction contingency of 10% of the construction cost. Construction inspection is 10%. So that is when the project is under construction. There's resident engineering that is overseeing the construction. Some utility locations, 3%. We didn't see that as a big issue out there. Traffic management would be very involved for the bridge over Route 128 I-95, but less so for the Charles River Bridge and other parts of the corridor. So that range depending on what we were looking at. And then also the design fee to do the engineering for the project. Usually a project like this is in engineering for several years, going through getting permitting and developing more detailed construction plans. So that's all included in these costs. And the costs don't include projects to the Upper Falls Greenway beyond Oak Street to accommodate shuttle service. And it doesn't include planning or construction costs to connect Community Way to the Needham Heights or the Newton Highlands Station. So with those sort of caveats, the overall cost you can see here, alternative 1, 22.2 million. This includes an inflation factor of 4% for 7 years. This reflects the fact that it takes quite a while to develop plans and get permitting before you're ready to actually, put the project out to bid. Would be at least 7 years. So we adopted a 4% inflation rate for 7 years. So that's all what you're seeing here in alternative 1. So the bike ped path 18 feet is 22.2 million. Alternative 2, which includes the shuttle option, ranges from 47.7 million to 59.9 million, depending on the bridge crossing. So the alternative 2A, which is 47.7 million, is the narrower 26-foot crossing of the Charles River Bridge. Alternative 2B is 59.9 million. That's just the full 34-foot bridge across the Charles. New abutments, that's 59.9 million. And then the option that had a separate shuttle bridge from a separate bike ped bridge is slightly less than alternative 2B at 55.8 million. You can see that the corridor improvements for alternative 2 are the same, 8.2 million to make the wider 34-foot path to accommodate the shuttle option. So that's 5 million more than the 18-foot bike ped path. The bridge over Route 128 I-95, again, that is the same in all of the alternative 2 options. It's about twice as much for the 34-foot bridge as for the 18-foot bridge in alternative 1. And so you can see the range here in terms of the cost for the Charles River Bridge. Okay, so in terms of the conclusion, so both projects appear to be feasible from an engineering point of view, from a permitting point of view. There are some design considerations, as I touched on as we went through the project area. Alternative 2 generally requires more earthwork, retaining walls, and vegetation removal due to, the wider 34-foot path. Both alternatives appear to maybe conflict with the encroaching landscaping at the Wingate residences. Route 128 bridge, you need to raise the grade on the easterly side. There would need to be a center pier in the highway median for a 2-span bridge. That would require review and approval for the bridge and also the center pier by MassDOT and FHWA. Charles River Bridge, the existing beam and abutments limit the width to an 18-foot bike ped path. The shuttle path will require, additional supporting structural work. And the permitting impacts with respect to the environmental permitting would be more steps with alternative 2 than alternative 1 because of the additional work in the river corridor with the structural abutments. Also, with respect to the MBTA lease that already exists for the Upper Falls Greenway, So that it currently does not allow motorized use, so that would require an amendment to accommodate alternative 2. So moving on to next steps. So basically with this information, the communities, Needham and Newton, should move together to develop a process to jointly determine a preferred alternative. And, the options are either alternative 1, as being preferred, would be a shared use path for pedestrians and bicycles only. For alternative 2, there is more needs to be understood about the shuttle service, what the operation is, what the routing is, what the ridership would be, and who the transit service provider would be. All of those questions are unknown at this time, and that would need to be understood and worked out before, moving ahead with that option. Another option is to not do any development at this time in the corridor. So basically, a couple of thoughts about a process for implementing the 2 alternatives. So for alternative 1, which is the bicycle and pedestrian path, the Needham primarily would need to negotiate a lease agreement with the MBTA to use the corridor for bicycles and pedestrians between the Needham limits at the Charles River to Webster Street. We recommend additional connectivity planning for connecting the northern terminus of the Upper Falls Greenway to the Newton Highland Station, as well as linking the Community Way, so this project, to the developing Bay Colony Rail Trail that's under development in Needham and to the south. So that is a project that has been identified as a priority for mass trails, because the length of it, eventually going to Rhode Island, the Bay Colony Rail Trail, would be a major bicycle and pedestrian path. And a longer path means, more users. And so, if you think about, dollars per user, the longer the path, the better that is for developing the rail, for developing a competitive project for funding. Initiating a project review process with Mass DOT District 6 in order to move ahead with this project, perhaps through TIP funding for construction, and then also fostering partnerships with Mass DOT and also the Department of Conservation and Recreation, which has jurisdiction over the Charles River, would be important steps in the planning and design for alternative 1. In terms of funding option, the project at this scale would likely be funded through the TIP or the Transportation Improvement Program for the region. With TIP funded projects, the local communities, project sponsors are responsible for doing, for funding the, or I should say typically they fund the engineering and design and planning for that. There are options for grants through Mass Trails, through local funding, even perhaps developer contributions to fund the design of the project. For alternative 2, if alternative 2 is the preferred alternative, there is quite a bit of transit planning that needs to be done in advance of applying for funding for the project. The towns would need to work with the MBTA, the Boston MPO, and stakeholders in both communities to understand the transit demand and potential solutions along the Community Way and also the Needham Street and Highland Avenue corridor. So one of the things that we struggled with a little bit in doing this feasibility study was that the transit alternative is not very well defined. There was a study done by the MAPC some time ago, I think maybe 10 years ago, that looked at ridership by basically using a modification of a shuttle, the Needham shuttle that is run by the Route 128 Council. that basically picks reverse commuters up at the Newton Highland Green Line station and distributes them primarily to Needham Crossing. And, so that is now almost 10 years old. So we need better ridership estimates. We need to understand, is that, are there other routing options, and what is the difference between using the community way versus using Needham Street, Highland Avenue, perhaps enabled with transit signal priority, which helps to expedite transit service. Cost estimates would need to be updated, including understanding what the cost is to improve the Upper Falls Greenway for the shuttle inclusive option, if that is part of what the transit route would be. And then we would need to identify a shuttle service provider. And the shuttle service provider, if public funds are being used to fund this project, which we assume it would be, then it needs to be a public transit service. So the TMA, the Route 128 Council runs the Needham shuttle right now. That's not public. You need to be a member in order to use those shuttles. So, the transit provider would need to be understood in terms of going forward with this project. And then finally, lease agreements with the MBTA allowing motorized use in both Needham and Newton in this corridor would need to be negotiated. In terms of funding options, similarly with alternative one, we probably, again, a project of this scale would probably be most likely funded through the TIP, the Transportation Improvement Program, some grants through MassWorks, which looks at economic development, infrastructure improvements related to economic development. Perhaps local funding, developer funds might be possible. Planning, similarly, local funding and grants to do the planning for alternative 2. So that concludes our presentation on the Community Way Feasibility Study. Again, the full study will be available on September 22nd. It'll be posted to the websites that both Needham and Newton have for the Community Way. With that, I'm going to turn it back to Shane to MC the questions and answers.
Thank you, Carolyn. That was a outstanding presentation. Lots of thorough information, which we greatly appreciate. I'm looking at the question and answer box, and I do not see any questions. So hopefully it was working on the user end, but we don't see any questions currently. So with that said, if we don't have any questions, what we can do is entertain taking live questions. What I would ask everyone to do is, if you have a question you'd like to ask, let's see, we have one popping up here. So great. Thank you very much, Jay. Jay asked, is the shuttle concept intended to support shuttles in both directions?
So, I mean, again, this is one of the, like I said, the struggles that we had when we were developing this is that not much has been, this is all this planning that I was talking about that needs to be done for the shuttle. But I mean, generally speaking, the buses would go in both directions. The section that we included was 1 lane. So, that could be one shuttle that goes back and forth. That could be a shuttle that does a loop where they use the community way in one direction and the street system in another direction. All of that needs to be analyzed in terms of the further transit planning that we had talked about before pursuing alternative 2. I think that it's like maybe 15 or less minutes going end to end. And, that's, the silver line is like 12 minutes. So, I mean, how that all works out has to be part of the analysis, but, service would presumably go between Needham and Newton in both directions. I don't know if Duncan has any thoughts on that. He's kind of the transit expert on our group.
Yeah, I'd be happy just to add a little bit. There are precedents out there for, if you will, single lane systems with passing provisions and signal protection. It's certainly possible to, in general, be a single lane and perhaps, have frequencies as tight as 12 or 15 minutes. It's doable, but as has been pointed out by Carolyn, considerably more analysis needs to be done to ascertain what the best way of doing that is.
We
Carolyn,
didn't do
Duncan, thank
two
you.
lanes, we did not do 2 lanes because, again, the MAPC study projected ridership of like 150 riders, which, yeah, I mean, it's not that much. So, more analysis needs to be done looking at ridership and routing.
Carolyn, thank you for that
Thank you. Shane.
answer. And Duncan, thank you for the additional input. Jay asked a follow-up question. Were there notable differences in the survey results between Needham and Newton? That's a great question, Jay.
Oh, I would have to go back in and look. I don't want to answer without kind of analyzing that in particular. But that's certainly something that we can look at. In terms of the preference, I assume between a shuttle inclusive option or not. That's a great question. And we'll look at that. We can add that to the website.
Yeah, so I'll ask Tyler, this is being recorded, so we will have the ability to look at these questions and go through them and provide written answers to everyone. So that is something that we will take away from this, is answering in written form to each one of these questions as well. So Jason asked, would any of the alternatives allow for a conversion to rail?
A conversion to heavy rail, like Green Line extension?
It says just rail. I would assume it would be light rail.
Light
but
rail.
Would the alternatives allow for a conversion to rail?
So I'm gonna call the structural team, but the bridges would not. The bridges that we assumed here, I do not have loading for rail. And Mike or Nicole can speak to that. Mike, do you want to jump into that?
Yeah, sorry, I was struggling with the buttons. Absolutely, yeah. The bridges we are designing here, or would be designed for this rail trail, are not going to support railroad loading. I don't think economically that would make sense for this project. And as far as the rail, you need so much space for a train to go down the path. So I think it would essentially take up the entire trail, and then there'd be nowhere for the people that are using the trail, pedestrians and bikes at that point.
Thank you, Mike and Carolyn.
I did want to say one thing, because there is often a question about, the Green Line extension potentially so far in the future. I mean, the right of way is owned by the MBTA, and, they can, recall it back for use if they want. I think there's like a 2-year notification that would all be in the agreement that's worked out between the MBTA and the communities. So, that's just something to consider.
So lots of questions coming in, some very good questions. We appreciate everyone. MC asked, are connections planned between this and the other Needham trail? And I could tackle that one from the Needham side of the house. MC, we would love to connect this to the other existing trail, but as Carolyn pointed out earlier, some of the problems that we have in that is that where the existing trail ends up to Webster Street is active rail line that the MBTA currently uses. The section in between where the current trail ends to Junction, they will not entertain at this time leasing that out or allowing that to be developed for a trail, because they need that for an emergency pull-off access. So yes, we would love to make those connections long-term, but there's lots more planning and studies that will need to be done, conversations in order to make those connections. But great question. Terrence has more of a comment here. Terrence says, I live on Evelyn Road, and the landscaping by Wingate provides a quality of life to the Wingate residents and the residences of Evelyn Road. If in future planning, the engineers and planners could take into consideration keeping as much landscaping as possible, especially because it's part of Wingate's special permit. So Terrence, that's a great comment. Thank you very much. When we make the decisions and as we make the decisions, and if we were to move forward with this, whatever option that would be, there would be plenty of other opportunities for public input, public meetings. There'd be several public meetings with that. Yes, we would certainly take into consideration beautifying this trail as we incorporate it as part of the construction. Carol Brown says, will there be any parking available at both ends for alternative 2? That's a great question.
That is a great question. So we were looking just within the corridor, and certainly parking is an excellent question, and that would need to be undertaken as part of sort of planning for the alternative, for either alternative really. Where could parking be accommodated for either the bike ped option or the shuttle inclusive option? But it's not accommodated within the corridor.
So Jeff Friedman asked, when the Muzzy Ford property is developed as currently planned, there will be significantly more traffic on Gould Street. Has this been considered in your plans for the crossing at the Gould Street crossing? So Jeff, that's a great question. In reality, we're not at the point to answer that question yet because we haven't got that deep. This is just simply a feasibility study. But yes, we would certainly look at the traffic counts as part of this if we move forward, especially at those at-grade crossings. As Carolyn indicated in the slide that you saw, the rectangular rapid flashing beacons, we would definitely take into account for traffic counts, in the infrastructure we would put into place would be determined based upon traffic counts, whether it would be a full signalized stop where it's protected for the pedestrians, or whether it would be just a rapid rectangle flashing beacon. So absolutely a great question. And yes, it would be in consideration should we move forward with this. Lance Brown says, shuttles were described as electric. Whether that means battery or catenary, which is envisioned in terms of supplying power?
That's an excellent question. I assume they'd be battery operated. It seems like
again,
most of them are.
I'll just jump in there. I mean, that's beyond what this study is. That would come as part of any transit study, and what the provider's going to, who the service provider is going to be, would determine all that.
Might I venture to offer something on that?
Sure.
Yeah, the state of the practice right now is, I think, any vehicle with the kind of speed range and capacity you're talking about now is well within the capability of, battery electric vehicles. So I don't think any of us were anticipating any kind of power distribution infrastructure.
Great, thank you, Duncan. MC asks a follow-up question. Would there be more extensive routing of the shuttle than the 1 mile in this project? I think Carolyn and John, you answered that, but in your previous answer, this is a feasibility study, as Carolyn indicated, in both alternatives, especially alternative 2. We would need to do an extensive transportation study. And as part of that study, we could look at this option, and there would be some recommendations that we would anticipate come out of whether or not that shuttle would just be within the 1 mile corridor, or if that shuttle could potentially extend outside of that corridor as well. But that would need to be as part of the transportation study that we would do if we wanted to go after option 2. Let's see here. I also have Daniel Lieber asked the question, could you expand on how this project relates to the Bay Colony Rail Trail? So James, Duncan, George, since you're all members of that and extensively involved, I'm going to turn this over to the three of you to tackle that question, if you would.
I can start if that's okay. This is James Goldstein. It fits into our long-range vision of the rail trail, connecting the Upper Falls Greenway over Route 128 and so forth to a new rail trail path in Needham that would go at least to Webster Street. We do understand that the MBTA is holding on to the right-of-way west of Webster Street. But we have had very early discussions with Needham officials about on-road options to get from this new path, which would end at Webster Street, basically through Needham Center, down to the MBTA commuter rail station at Needham Junction. And as some of you may know, there's already a plan to extend the existing Needham Rail Trail to Chestnut Street, which is adjacent to Needham Junction. So it's very consistent with that long-term vision, but I have to stress it's a long-term vision and it's not happening imminently, but that is the plan, the vision and hope. And the Needham officials are conceptually in favor of that vision.
On the Newton side, the utility of the Upper Falls Greenway to bikers and pedestrians could be enhanced by connection to Needham and eventually connection to the rest of the Bay Colony Rail Trail. The further it goes, the more people have access to it, the further you can use it for recreation and commuting. And the Upper Falls community has consistently come out in favor of enhancing the path, improving connectivity, and extending it.
That's currently all of the questions I see in the Q&A. We still do have another 20 minutes or so available. If there are any more questions that you'd like to go ahead and type in, you can. One thing I'd like to do is I understand that our select board chair, Marianne Cooley, for Needham was having some technical difficulties getting online earlier. So Marianne, I wanted to recognize you as being a part of this. Thank you for joining us. I'm not sure if there's any comments you'd like to make while we have a chance to allow for some additional questions. Marianne, I see your hand is raised. Tyler, can you allow her access to speak if she doesn't have so already?
Yep. She's
There she is.
there she is.
So I'm sorry, I actually was multitasking, so I missed the first part of it because I was in a different session. What I do want to say is that the select board is looking forward to having this discussion next week. It's helpful to hear some of the questions that came up tonight. And we look forward to understanding what the prospects are for this going forward.
Thank you very much. Marianne, I'm not sure if you're available, but once this meeting is over, we're going to keep the panelists. If you could stay on, I had a question for you as well.
Okay.
So just a reminder to everyone, I don't see any additional questions, but this has been recorded. We've recorded this from the beginning of the meeting. We will post this on both the Needham website project page, as well as the Newton website project page. So the recording will be posted there. If you'd like to see past meetings, the recordings from those past meetings should be posted on the project pages for both communities, and the survey results as well. Let's see, I did have one other one here. Let me just make sure. Nope, it does not look like we have any others. Josh, I saw your hand is raised.
Thank you, Shane. Well, I just want to talk for a moment about what Newton staff are talking about with this project. You know, we've been happy to participate in the past year or so. This has been ongoing, and we've had a lot of discussions. Myself and my counterpart Jennifer Steele, our chief environmental planner, who's also a member of the working group, but has a conflicting meeting tonight. We want to let this feasibility study process conclude and make sure that the public has the opportunity to review the work the working group does, and digest it and comment. You know, we have a great resource in the Greenway. We want to see it be as vital and vibrant as we can. It's connecting to a lot of new development. It's providing an important recreational outlet. We are looking at ways to resolve some of the connections at the northern end. I know that George, who I'm happy to serve with here, Kirby, and others in Newton are very interested in how we can improve active transportation connections, but being faithful to the legislation that enabled this study, and the investment of time that's been made. I think we want to wait and assess the results and recommendations, findings before engaging with the public process. But I want to just honor the suggestion in the presentation that there would be a collaborative approach between Newton and Needham on this. And the only, I guess, thing I'd add on that is my take on the part about funding and next steps is that the overwhelming amount of capital cost and the design expense would be associated with a bridge over the state highway. It happens to be in Needham, but it's owned by Mass DOT. And I would think that they would have a very important role to play in this and in making anything like this be a reality. So my draft recommendations are that that primarily Needham engage with MassDOT and try to frame this as a project that's consistent with the statewide and regional vision for transportation and give them the opportunity to take a leading role, as opposed to the taxpayers of Needham. Not to say that Shane doesn't want to ask, entirely don't want to see Needham taxpayers pay, tens of millions of dollars, but this is, and there's plenty of precedent for the state doing planning for projects that end up on the tip and then are then funded with federal and state dollars. So those are things to talk about downstream. I think this has been an important work product. The other thing I'd like to say is that there's been a series of reports that have been done on the issue of light rail and extending the Green Line along the historic Charles River branch that dates back to the 1800s. And that obviously, provided rail. That's how the Back Bay was filled, many years ago, before I was born, in fact. How we engage any discussion of transit, whether it's light rail, as some have recommended, or a busway, to me, the most important entity at that table is the MBTA. Between the two communities, we're funding the MBTA with our assessments over $7 million a year. They are the primary public transit provider in this region. I would think that any lease that would be undertaken for the land for an active transportation would implicitly mean, or maybe it needs to be made explicit, that the MBTA wants this to be an active transportation corridor that is non-motorized. If they feel otherwise and they want to have some public transit, then great. That is what they're in the business of providing. But I would really engage and encourage Needham to engage the MBTA in that discussion downstream after we've finished this important public process. Anyone who knows me know I could speak longer, but I will yield.
Thank you, Josh. Appreciate it. I'd just like to echo some of Josh's comments with, first of all, we're not done yet. So please don't feel like this is the end, because it's not. This upcoming Tuesday, as I said at the beginning of the meeting, GPI and the team will be presenting to the Needham Select Board. So we encourage you, if you'd like to attend that, you're more than welcome to attend that meeting to hear more about this, or if you know of anyone that was not able to attend. Secondly, again, we do have a draft review that we're going through currently. We're providing feedbacks. The working group is providing feedback to the GPI team. And that feedback is due on the 15th, and then GPI will produce the final report to us on Friday, September 22nd. We will make sure that we post that final report on both the Needham page and the Newton page, and we want to hear back from the community when we post that. So as we post this, I believe Newton's plan and certainly Needham's plan is to provide an email address for feedback on the final draft document. We will follow up after this. We'll give the community some time to get some feedback. We'll follow back, and then we'll pull a working group back together, and we'll make some of those decisions collectively on what our next steps are and what direction we would go. Also, I wanted to recognize, I didn't see him earlier, but I wanted to recognize former select board member John Bullion, who's on the line tonight. John, great to see your name. Would have loved to see your face, but great to see that you're on the line tonight. John was a huge advocate as part of this. I remember having discussions with John over 8 years ago when I was with the DPW in Newton, and we were doing the Upper Falls Greenway, and we're initiating some of those discussions on what the future holds for the railway. So John, great to see you on the line tonight as well. With that said, I don't see any other questions and I don't see any other hands raised. So just want to say thank you to everyone for attending. Thanks for spending your 90 minutes of your time tonight with us. We do appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed it. We hope you enjoyed it and that you got some great information out of this. And we look forward to the next steps and seeing where we go, both communities. So everyone have a great evening. If we can, the panelists, please hang on board, and everyone have a great evening. Panelists will stay around to discuss a few other things. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.